Now, in the second half of 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul is going to give instructions for men and women. 2 Timothy chapter 2, beginning in verse 8, he says, "Therefore I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Likewise I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." So here he's giving certain instructions, and for the men here, it goes back to what he was talking about in the first part of this chapter, where he says that we are to pray for all men and for kings and for all who are in authority, and we talked about that already earlier in the study of this chapter. But he talks about here, men are to pray, going back to what he says here, that these are the prayers that are to be offered. Now, obviously we understand that women also can pray. It's not saying that, well, men are only allowed to pray and women cannot pray. But the emphasis here is on a public or a leadership role. So men, as you have a leadership role, and this is implied in the instructions he's going to give to the women here as we're going to read further on in this passage. He says, men, you are to pray. But he gives certain instructions here about how they are to pray. He says you are to lift up holy hands without wrath and dissension. So there's an emphasis here on holiness, recognizing that because you are the people of God, you have been set apart. Jesus came to give himself as a ransom for all, as Paul talked about in the verses right before this. And so if you belong to him, you are a special people. You are distinct from the world. And so you're to act that way. And so in lifting up holy hands, is this emphasis on holiness. You offer these prayers to God. And so he tells the men here, you do this without wrath and dissension. That you are to exercise self-control. You're not to act in a way that detracts from what you're trying to do and what you're trying to represent. Because again, this is an emphasis on something that is public, that you have some type of role that is over others or representing the church. Do this without wrath and without dissension. Make sure that you are representing the Lord and his people properly. Paul would talk about this representation or this example that you show later in this letter to Timothy in chapter 4 about Timothy's example. But here now he's talking about the men in every place. You pray, you lift up holy hands, recognizing that you are set apart. You do this without wrath, that you exercise self-control, that you are controlled over your emotions, that you are not involved in outbursts or things like that, and you do this without dissension or division, that you are working to be peacemakers. So here's the emphasis here for men, that yes, you are to pray, but you also to watch your character, you watch who you are, and make sure that you are properly representing the Lord and his people. Pray at every place, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. And then on this point of how we represent the Lord and his people, he turns his attention then to women. He says women are to be modest, to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly. In talking about modesty here, and he goes on and talks about not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly garments. You are not to be drawing attention to yourselves. And he talks about, with the braided hair, gold and pearls and costly garments, he's describing this gaudy, expensive clothing that was designed to draw attention to the person. Draw attention so that they could receive the praise, they could receive the views from others. They could be recognized as supposedly someone important. Paul says that when you dress in the clothing that you wear, dress modestly and discreetly. Don't be doing this to draw undue attention to yourself. Now, this does not mean women can't wear nice clothes, but he's talking about something that is over the top, something that is above and beyond what other people are wearing because you want to top them. You want to be seen as someone more important or someone who is more well off than they are. So he's talking about this gaudy and expensive clothing. However, the principle here would also apply to another type of clothing that would draw unnecessary attention to oneself, and that would be inadequate, or we often call it immodest clothing, though what he's describing here is also immodest clothing. But when we think of immodest clothing, usually we think about clothing that exposes too much of one's body. That would be included in here also. Because again, it's drawing attention to one's self. And we think about, when we talked about the men, how they were to recognize that they were representing the Lord and his people. The same thing with the women here. That when they dress a certain way, again, this is not to say that men don't need to be mindful of how they dress. They do. But here he gives the emphasis on women. He says, you make sure that the way that you dress is a way that properly represents the Lord and his people. You're not drawing attention to you, because the focus isn't to be on you. Again, you are to be one who is making a claim of godliness by means of good works. This is how you are to adorn yourself. Not with the clothing, not think, well, if I wear this gaudy, expensive thing, that's going to draw attention to me. Or, well, I'm just going to expose all of these parts of my body because I want to draw attention to me. I want people to notice me. No, he says, by means of good works, as is proper for a woman making a claim to godliness. We are making a claim by the way we present ourselves. That's his point here. And so he's talking to the women. He says, you be careful how you present yourself. What are you saying with your clothing? What are you saying with, and really this principle is not just about clothing, but your speech and your behavior and all these things. What are you saying with those things? Are you making a claim to godliness, or are you simply drawing attention to yourself so that people notice you for, again, whatever the reason might be? Are you making a claim to godliness? Show these good works. That should be what you're known for. But then, in referring to the women here, he says that I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Again, this goes back to what we mentioned earlier, that this is talking about positions of leadership or something that is public. He says, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. This is obviously something that is controversial today. Whether a woman can be in a role of a preacher or have that type of leadership role over the church. What Paul is talking about here are gender roles between men and women. There's a different role that God has given each one. It's not about inferiority, that women are not as good as men or not as smart as men. That's not what the point is here. That's nowhere in the text. Instead, this is simply about gender roles. Men have a role and women have a role. So he says, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. When it comes to preaching and teaching and leadership in the church, those roles are reserved for the men, and they need to step up and take those roles. When we have people who are arguing that women should be in those roles, well, that's really a failure of the men to do what they ought to be doing, to take those roles and to exercise them properly. But when you have men either unwilling to fulfill those roles or they abuse those roles, well, then it's a lot more likely, and people are a lot more interested in having women fill those roles. So men need to step up and fill those roles and do them properly according to God's will, because this is his design. Men and women have different roles. And he explains that this goes back to the creation. This is where this comes from. He goes on in 1 Timothy 2, verse 13, "For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint." So why does Paul give these instructions? And again, as we noticed earlier, when Paul says that he was appointed as a preacher, an apostle, and a teacher in verse 7, he was fulfilling the role of an ambassador for Christ, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 20, the official spokesman for Christ. So when Paul, acting as the official spokesman for Christ here, why is he saying this? Why does he say that women are to not teach or exercise authority over men? Why does he make those instructions there? Well, because it was based on the creation and the fall. He says it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. When God created man and woman in the beginning, he created Adam first. He didn't create them at the same time. He didn't create Eve first. He created Adam first. So God's design from the beginning is this is what he put in place. Adam was first created, and then Eve. But then he says it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. So we go back to Genesis chapter 3 and read about what happened. Who was it that the serpent targeted? And we're not told why he targeted Eve first. It simply says that she was the one who was tempted. She was the one who was deceived. And then she gave the fruit to her husband also, and he ate. So from the beginning, you have God made Adam first and then Eve. Then Eve was the one who fell into transgression. She was the one who was deceived and then led her husband, led Adam into sin. So when Paul talks about these roles, he's not just making something up. And he's not saying, well, this is my opinion, or this is what, we the apostles decided. He's not talking about, well, this is what our culture says. And, as long as culture's like this, well, that's what we're going to do. No, he goes all the way back before there was culture. Before all of that, he says God made Adam first. And then he made Eve. And Eve was the one who was deceived and fell into transgression. So this is not about, well, are women today as smart as men or as capable as men? It has nothing to do with that. This is simply about the roles that God has given to men and women, and these have been in place since the beginning. And then he talks about there in verse 15 that women do have a special role. Women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. They have a special role, but they need to continue in those three things: in faith and love and sanctity or holiness. That's really going back to with the men, where they lift up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Well, that's the same thing that he's talking about with the women here. They continue in faith and love and sanctity, and so with self-restraint. Going back to the idea of modesty. They need to remember who they are representing the Lord and his people, and present themselves in a way that reflects that. Same is true with the men. Where they are lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension, remember who you represent. You represent the Lord and his people. So there are different roles for men and women, and so different instructions are given. But for all of us, that's what we need to remember. We represent the Lord and his people. So we need to conduct ourselves and present ourselves in a way that reflects that.